and welcome everyone. We are standing right now in a 204-year-old historic house. And unfortunately, you couldn't be here in person with me, but we figured the next best thing was to give a virtual tour of this space. So you'll be able to accompany as we explore this house that is first built in 1816 by Judge Elijah Miller, who I'm going to introduce a bit more formally when we make our way into the next room. But as I mentioned, right now we are standing in a 204-year-old historic house. And as we move room to room, we're going to be learning about some topics such as Secretary of State William Henry Seward, his wife Frances, who was a radical abolitionist, using this very house as a stop on the Underground Railroad during the 1850s. And you might not know what some of these terms mean, but as we move room to room, we're going to be discussing them and the ties they have to this house. Now, what makes this house, and what I mean by that is the Seward House Museum, which we're going to explore today, so unique and so special, is that 99% of everything we are going to see here today during your virtual tour actually belongs to the Seward family. So these aren't recreations, these aren't period pieces, these are items of history that the family used in their day-to-day life. And because of this, as we move throughout the rooms, we can really explore their story and what life was like for them in the 19th century. Now, if you follow me, we're going to make proper introductions to this family as we learn about them. And welcome to the Seward family parlor. So you are standing in a very important room, and one of the original rooms when this house is first constructed. Now, there are 33 rooms in total if you're to visit the house today. But when it's first built in 1816, there are only 10 rooms. And this is one of those original rooms because it's so important. You have to think in the 19th century, life was very different. There's no Snapchatting, there's no texting, there's no emailing. Really the only way you could make an introduction to a family was either writing a letter or paying a face-to-face visit. And that's what this room was used for. It was used for entertaining social callers. So visitors would walk through the main doorway. If they timed their arrival properly, they would be greeted by a family servant, led into this space, and they could expect to spend 10 or 15 minutes in the Seward family parlor trying to impress the family, trying to develop a relationship with them. And in the same way that these social callers were looking to impress the Seward family, the Sewards are looking to do the same things. When we have school groups visit here, when we have our public tours run through here, several of the ways that our visitors describe this room as being decorated, as being fancy, as being ornate. This was a room that's meant to leave an impression. When these social callers visited the Seward family, they're looking to impress them, and equally, the Seward family is looking to use this room to impress their social callers. So as you're showing around this room, you'll see a table from Japan, a sculpture in the corner of a black bear, which Seward acquires while traveling throughout Germany, Italian statues, everything is gilded in gold. This is a room that's meant to leave an impression. And seeing as historically, this was a room where social callers would be introduced to the family, this is where we like introducing our visitors to the Seward family themselves. Starting with the man who builds this house in 1816, Elijah Miller, who you can see to my left here. Now, when Elijah Miller is building this house in 1816, Auburn had only been chartered as a village for a year at this point, and Elijah Miller had made most of his money in land speculation, accumulated a pretty impressive amount of wealth, which allowed him to build this 10-room traditional Federal-style house as one of the first brick buildings here in Auburn. But he's not alone when he begins constructing this house. He brings with him two daughters, Lizette Miller and then Frances Miller, who you can see to my left here. Now, Elijah Miller, realizing the inequalities of the 19th century, and by that I mean the things that were happening that today we know are wrong, but in the 19th century were happening and had a lot of support. Things like the institution of slavery, eventually segregation following the Civil War, women not having the same rights as men. Well, Elijah Miller knew these things were going on. And when he brings his daughters here to Auburn, he wants to make sure that they receive an education equal and comparable to anything any young male is going to receive during this time. So he ends up sending them to 3 different schools to make this happen. First, a local school right here in Auburn, After that, he sends them to a Quaker school in Aurora, and then Frances attends the Troy Female Seminary. And this school, which will go on to be named the Al Willard School, is offering the best education a person could receive during this time. And during this education, Frances and Lizette study reading, they study writing, they study math and science. And this education sticks with Frances and Lizette for the rest of their lives. They are going to be involved in the women's rights movement, fighting to make society more equal in that right. And Frances is also going to be a radical abolitionist. She actually uses this house as a stop on the Underground Railroad. And if you're unfamiliar with what the term abolitionist means, someone who is an abolitionist is against the institution of slavery and wants to see it ended immediately. And this was Frances to a T. She hated the institution of slavery, so much so that she risked breaking federal law, or law made by the United States government, helping passengers on the Underground Railroad escape from slavery in the South and make their way north to Canada in the pursuit of freedom. Now, Frances would be a radical abolitionist, and this stems from that education that she receives at the Troy Female Seminary, as well as the friends that she kept here in Auburn. It's also where she's introduced to her future husband. She eventually befriends a young woman, Cornelia Seward, visits the Seward family in Florida, New York, where she's introduced to this museum's namesake and Cornelia's older brother, William Henry Seward. Now, Seward's upbringing was very similar to Frances's. Well educated, his father decides to invest in his education. He attends Union College, eventually graduates in good standing, and then studies law, eventually becoming a lawyer. And as luck would have it, he makes a visit to Auburn, looking to call on Frances, or basically to ask her on a date. And Elijah Miller at this point is continuing on as a land speculator, but he also is opening a law firm, and he's looking for a junior partner. So Seward, to my right, begins working with Elijah Miller, who builds this house. Within a year, he's asking to marry his boss's daughter, Frances. And when Seward approaches Elijah Miller, the only way he'll agree to the marriage proposal is that for as long as he's alive, they move into the house with him. Seward agrees, and within a year, Seward and Frances are married and moving into this house here. Now, for most of our visitors who travel all over the world to learn about this history, they're familiar with Seward not as a lawyer, but as a political figure. And this is a political career that spans 40 years, 3 different political parties, and 4 different offices. We're going to get into those in the next room. So if you'll follow me. Here we are in the Seward family library. So we just went from a very public space in the Seward family parlor to a very private space here. And surrounding us are 2,000 pieces of evidence that this family really liked to read. And these books are the perfect insight into the way the Seward family thinks. When we as workers at the museum are trying to understand the Seward family's motives, the way they thought during the 19th century, we have a couple different sources we can turn to. Now, the family are constantly writing letters to each other, giving us a lot of written words, and the letters sent to each other are certainly important. But these books are going to be insight into what they were thinking as well. Oftentimes, when we're trying to learn about the family, we'll ask our curator to don those very special gloves to make sure to preserve the integrity of this collection. She'll take down one of the books and open up the pages to find them making underlines or find them making notes. These books are really an insight into the way the family were thinking during this time. Now, most of the collection in the library surrounding us here are going to be books that belong to either Seward and Frances, a lot of nonfiction titles. So these are books about politics, these are books about history. These are the books that Seward and Frances are using to really shape their understanding of the 19th century world. But we have one exception, and it can be seen behind the glass case here. Now, this library is going to be very special to our story here, and it's going to give us a lot of insight into what life was like during the 19th century for a young woman. Now, above, you'll see a photograph of William Henry Seward sitting down, and next to him is his teenage daughter, Fanny Seward. And this photograph marks an extremely important time in both of their lives. For Frances, who's entering her teenage years in this portrait, this is her first chance to really see the world. Before this photograph is taken, she is constantly suffering from bouts of ill health, making it very difficult for her to leave Auburn. But when Matthew Brady snaps this photo in his New York City office, she's accompanying her father on a political campaign throughout New York, throughout all of New England, and throughout the Midwest. Interestingly enough, not campaigning for himself, this political figure who holds 4 different offices in his life, but campaigning for that man in the corner, who I'm sure is a very familiar face, Abraham Lincoln. So Fanny and Seward will travel throughout the United States trying to rally the political party behind this relatively unknown figure in Abraham Lincoln. Now, this proves successful. Lincoln is appointed 16th President of the United States, and shortly after his appointment to President of the United States, the Winter of Secession breaks out. Not long after that, the American Civil War starts. Now, when Abraham Lincoln is trying to figure out how to navigate this unprecedented moment in American history, nothing like this had ever happened before, he decides to pull together a political team, or a cabinet. And as he's pulling together this cabinet, he's approached by a man, Thurlow Weed, who's Seward's political advisor. And when Thurlow Weed approaches Abraham Lincoln, he makes a couple good points. First, he points out that he knows someone who has served in over 3 different political offices at this point. Very important. He points out that the same figure loves to travel and would be really good at working with other countries. And lastly, Thurlow Weed highlights the fact that Lincoln kind of owes this guy, seeing as he had just campaigned all throughout the United States rallying the Republican Party behind him. And of course, Thurlow Weed is talking about his political advisee, William Henry Seward here. And Lincoln agrees with all of Thurlow Weed's points. He decides to appoint Seward as his Secretary of State. And as Secretary of State, it's William Henry Seward's job to work with all of the other countries that the United States was involved with and develop good relationships with them. Now, Lincoln and Seward become close personal friends, and the two of them work closely trying to navigate this unprecedented moment in American history. Now, Seward would spend his civil years primarily in Washington, D.C. beside Abraham Lincoln. But when the war ends, a year of tragedy falls on this family. First, Seward survives an assassination attempt on the same night that Abraham Lincoln, his close friend, will be killed. Seward finds out about the passing of Lincoln and is heartbroken. 9 weeks after, he loses his wife Frances due to a series of shocks. And then later that year, after all of this pre-existing tragedy, Seward's daughter Fanny passes away just shy of her 22nd birthday at the age of 21. And Seward is grief-stricken. He refers to the passing of Fanny Seward as his great unspeakable sorrow, and he wants to preserve her legacy for all time. So what Seward does, knowing that his daughter is an aspiring author who cherishes her books, he gathers those items together, and he sends them here to Auburn to commemorate his daughter's legacy behind this glass case, preserving for all times those things that mattered most to Fanny Seward. Now, if you'll follow me, we are going to be stepping foot into the first addition that we've been in into the house. So here we are in the Seward family dining room. And as I mentioned in the front hall, this house is constantly changing. When Seward first moves here, there is only 10 rooms. When he ends up passing away, there are around 33 rooms in total. And during his time living here, one of the first additions he wants to make is increasing the size of the dining room and bringing it from the original basement of the house upstairs. So first, Seward expands the dining room and kitchen, making his way to where the gift shop is today. And it's not until 1866 when Seward fully expands this room, that it looks like what it does today. And the whole purpose of this expansion is the centerpiece here, the dining room table, which along with being the perfect centerpiece for a room like this, is going to be a key component of Seward's political process. Now, Seward is remembered by historians as one of the best figures at using dining room diplomacy to achieve what he's remembered for. And dining room diplomacy is exactly what it sounds like. If Seward needs to get you to join his side politically, he's going to invite you to a dinner party at this dining room table, which right now is seated for 12, but extends all the way out to host 24 visitors. You can expect to eat 12 courses of food, and you're going to be there for the evening, where Seward is going to sit at the head of the table where you are now, and he's going to convince these political figures to join his side. And he is very convincing at doing this. Now, during the Civil War years, Seward is charged with a very difficult task, and that's keeping this a civil war. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the Civil War, with the American Civil War, but as you study history, you'll see the Spanish Civil War. You'll see civil wars happening all over. And that's because the term civil war means a country fighting within itself. So Seward is looking to keep this a civil war as opposed to an international crisis. He doesn't want other countries becoming involved. And the way Seward preserves it, maintains things the way they are, is he invites state ministers from all over the world to these dinner parties. And he convinces this to leave it a United States affair. They don't need to become involved. Let the Union fight to regain the Union as a whole and stay out of the United States business. And he does this by using dining room diplomacy. Very convincing in how he does it. Now, after the Civil War ends, Seward's role as Secretary of State changes significantly. He's no longer worried about keeping countries from joining the Civil War. Now he can focus on his vision of the United States. And what Seward is most familiar for by many of our visitors is Seward's folly, or Seward's mistake. And here we can see a portrait of Seward's folly in process. Now, after the Civil War ends, Seward is focused on trying to acquire territories for the United States. He is eventually approached by Russian diplomat Edward B. Stokel, who we can see with his hand hovering above the Alaska territories here, who had been granted permission to sell Alaska from Russia to the United States. And Seward is overjoyed. This fits perfectly into his vision. So the two entourages, or two groups, gather together in the State Department. And here we see them working together to fill out the Treaty of Cessions. And when the Treaty of Cessions is signed, Alaska is sold to the United States for $7.2 million. $7.2 million, that's a lot. But it's not done yet. Just because Seward's signature is on there doesn't make it official. And for Seward, who's working in the cabinet of Andrew Johnson, a not very popular president, a lot of his contemporaries, a lot of his friends don't think he's going to be able to get support. So what Seward does is he hosts 4 major dinner parties over the next 2 weeks after he signs the Treaty of Cessions. He invites all of the senators over. He is serving them Alaskan delicacies. He is serving them seafood caught off the coast of Alaska. He is gifting their wives Alaskan furs, highlighting how much potential Alaska has. And if proves successful, it gets voted through the Senate 37-2, so overwhelmingly in favor. And when Seward retires from public office, he starts getting ridiculed. People start making fun of him, referring to it as Seward's folly or Seward's mistake, saying that he wasted $7.2 million buying Alaska. But then at the end of the 19th century, something changes. They discover gold, and people start to reevaluate Seward's decision to buy Alaska. After that, they discover oil and all the national parks. It really becomes a crowning achievement of what Seward is remembered for. Now, Seward uses dining room diplomacy to eventually purchase Alaska. We're going to withdraw into the drawing room, which is going to be another key component of dining room diplomacy. Here we are in the drawing room, again, part of that 1866 edition that really changes the architecture of this house. Now, this would often be used as a backdrop to dining room diplomacy. So after you ate your 12 courses, when the party split into groups, this is the room where you would be entertained. But along with being the backdrop to dining room diplomacy, here in the drawing room is where the family would spend much of its time together. And this is where we like making our introductions to the next generation of the Seward family, starting with Seward's oldest son, Augustus Seward, or Gus, who you can see here. I mentioned in the library that while we're working at the museum, we're constantly trying to develop our understanding of the family. We're turning to letters they wrote, the journals that Fanny Seward kept. We're turning to the books that they actually wrote. Several of them are authors. These are how we understand the family. The problem is, Gus Seward doesn't write much, which makes him a little bit of a mystery in our story. And he ends up serving in the military after attending West Point. And his first station after graduating is the Mexican-American War, which his mother is very much against. During this time, she is writing him letters telling him so. And from there, the paper trail really dries up on Gus Seward. Most of his correspondence after the Mexican-American War are mostly through telegram, so we don't really have a lot of resources to get to know Gus Seward as a historic figure. But the good news for us is Seward's next oldest son is kind enough to write a book about himself, so it's a little bit easier to get to know Fred Seward. You can see Fred Seward to the left of this archway here. And he literally follows in his father's footsteps. He will become the Assistant Secretary of State. His wife, Anna Seward, will serve as the premier, meaning the best Washington, D.C. hostess, starting in the mid-1850s. So in many ways, it's going to be William Seward, his son Frederick, and his daughter-in-law, Anna Seward, navigating Washington, D.C. during the Civil War years. Now, they're not the only ones who are there. Here we have a giant portrait of Fanny Seward, who I'll come back to in a little bit. But the three who I just introduced are there in a pivotal moment in Seward family history. After the Civil War ends, Abraham Lincoln will be targeted by an assassin, John Wilkes Booth. And for most of our visitors, they're familiar with that story. That's something that's really become popular as Americans study history. But something that's a little less known is he's not the only target that night. Vice President Andrew Johnson has a man assigned to assassinate him as well as the Secretary of State William Henry Seward, a former Confederate soldier named Lewis Powell. And of those targets, Powell's got the easiest one, because 9 days before the assassination is scheduled to take place, Seward is involved in a carriage accident. He's riding the carriage with Frederick and Fanny. Something startles the horse, and as he looks to gain control of the reins, he's thrown from the carriage. He suffers a broken jaw, broken collarbone. He's in pretty bad shape. And because of this, most of the rest of the family gathers together in Washington, D.C. to help support him. Now, this news spreads throughout Washington, D.C., and Lewis Powell finds out about it as well. On the night of April 14th, the same time John Wilkes Booth makes his way to Ford's Theater, Lewis Powell knocks on Seward's Washington, D.C. room and attacks the family. He wounds 5 people in total. Frederick Seward here will be wounded quite significantly. Gus Seward, military medic George Robinson, another delivery boy who was looking to stop the attack, and Seward himself will bear the scars from the attack for the rest of his life. But they end up surviving. Now, that night could have been a mystery to us. However, Fanny Seward was stationed in her father's room reading to him when Lewis Powell charged in. So much of what we know about the assassination attack on William Henry Seward is thanks to Fanny Seward, who we see here. And in the same way that the assassination story is a fairly sad and morbid story, this portrait itself has quite the story behind it. When you look at it, not a lot stands out, as we're in a room surrounded by portraits. But when you look closer, you'll notice some strange symbolism which artist Emanuel Leutze went out of his way to include. Here we see a bouquet about to fall from her grip, a very pale left hand, almost ghost-like. Beside her are morning glories to the right, and to the left, you'll notice it looks like it's fall. The leaves are starting to turn orange in the tree. And the last act of symbolism that Leutze includes will be the fact it's very stormy behind her, overcast even, and she's staring off into the only break in the sky. And this symbolism is included because this is a posthumous portrait. This is completed after Fanny Seward passes away of tuberculosis at the age of 21. And it seems strange to us. Why would Seward want to include all this imagery referencing his daughter's death if this is his great unspeakable sorrow? And that's because this is a space of entertaining. So by including those symbolism, people would know not to ask questions about the subject of this portrait. Now there is one last Seward member who I forgot to mention. Will Jr. is not there on the night of the assassination attempt. And you can see his portrait to the left of Fanny. Now Will Jr. will serve during the Civil War, most notably in the Battle of Monocacy. He ends up promoted to Brigadier General for his actions on the battlefield that evening. Now, after he retires from the military, he returns here to Auburn, runs 2 banks, and serves on the board of American Express. And eventually this house will be left to Will Jr., then to his son Will III, and then eventually it'll open up in 1955 as a museum, which is how we have all the collection pieces here that we're able to enjoy. Now that leads us, we've got one last room that I want to show. Here we are in the original kitchen of the house. So think all the way back to the dining room upstairs, and imagine having to prepare 12 courses of food for 12 to 24 people in this space, walk up the stairs, deliver that food, and then bring it back down. It'd be almost impossible. So what ends up happening is when Seward brings the dining room upstairs, he brings the kitchen upstairs as well. And that happens in 1848, which would then essentially make this area dead space. They're not using it for anything at this point. And in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act is passed, making it illegal to help people who had self-liberated from slavery make their way north to freedom. And that's when this space transforms from the original kitchen of the house to a stop on the Underground Railroad. Now, as I mentioned upstairs, this was spearheaded by Francis Seward, who was a radical abolitionist, wanted to see slavery end immediately. So during the 1850s, while Seward is serving as a United States Senator, Francis would be using the spot here as a stop on the Underground Railroad. Now that concludes our tour today. I hope you enjoyed your virtual visit to the Seward House Museum. Although we're closed to the public right now, when we open back up, I hope you'll join us and go on an actual physical tour of the museum. But thanks for stopping by.